This is Veda. The night I walked away from my marriage had no shouting, no tears, and no slamming doors. It happened quietly in a restaurant that once represented everything I thought love should be. Barrett, my husband of 8 years, sat across from me at a small corner table. It was the same place where he had proposed, the same table where he had once promised we would grow old together. Now, it was where we had agreed to say goodbye. He arrived late, with no apology and no explanation. His attention never left his phone for a second. I didn't need to ask who he was texting. I already knew. It was Celine, his secretary, the woman who had slowly been replacing me while I was still legally his wife. I ordered his favorite dish out of habit, not love. He barely noticed. He cut his meat, chewed without interest, and smiled at his screen, treating me like a task he had already finished. I told him I was leaving the city. I told him I was moving to a small coastal town. He looked up, surprised for just a moment, and then shrugged. "Whatever you want," he said. "Celine and I are planning our wedding. She knows how to make me happy." That was when something inside me went silent. I wasn't angry, I wasn't heartbroken. I was simply done. That dinner wasn't about finding closure. It was about letting go, about cutting the last invisible thread that tied me to a man who had already erased me from his future. When we stood up, he paid the bill and left without looking back. No goodbye, no gratitude, no regret. I stood there alone, looking at a plate I couldn't finish, finally understanding the truth. I wasn't losing a husband. I was gaining my freedom, and that quiet decision would change everything. People often think a marriage ends because of a dramatic betrayal, a scandal, a fight, or another woman. But my marriage didn't collapse in a single moment. It wore away silently, day after day, until there was nothing left to save. When Barrett and I got married, we were a team. We were young, ambitious, and building everything together. I believed in him when no one else did. I supported his career, managed our home, and put my own goals on hold because I thought that's what love required. As his career took off, something changed. Barrett began to see himself as the center of the world. His work mattered, his stress mattered, his time mattered. Mine became flexible, optional, invisible. Our conversations turned into instructions, and affection turned into silence. I became someone who handled logistics, not a partner whose opinions mattered. When I talked about my work or my ideas, he barely listened. When I was tired, he told me I had it easy. Our marriage became like a house with a beautiful exterior but crumbling foundations. To others, we looked successful, well-dressed, educated, and stable. But inside, I was living with an emotional neglect that was slowly draining the life out of me. Barrett didn't insult me to my face. He did something worse. He dismissed me. He made me feel unnecessary, replaceable. I learned to stop asking questions. I learned to stop expecting gratitude. I learned to swallow my disappointment and tell myself that this was normal, that marriage required sacrifice, that love meant enduring. But there's a difference between compromise and being erased. I wasn't unhappy because Barrett worked late. I was unhappy because I no longer existed in his life as a person. I was an accessory to his success, a background character in a story he believed was only about him. When Celine appeared, the marriage was already dying. She didn't destroy something strong. She walked into a space that had been empty for a very long time. Deep down, I knew it. That realization didn't make me explode with fury. It just left me tired. When I discovered the truth about Celine, there was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no tears spilled on the kitchen floor. What I felt in that moment wasn't rage. It was clarity. I found the messages by accident. Barrett had left his laptop open on the dining room table. A notification popped up with her name, a heart emoji, and familiar words that once belonged to me. I read just enough to understand everything. They weren't talking like two people who had just crossed a line. They were talking like two people already living in a future where I didn't exist. They had plans, inside jokes, and subtle but cruel complaints about me. I closed the laptop gently, as if making a sound might shatter the fragile calm that was holding me together. That night, Barrett came home late. He smelled of unfamiliar perfume and false confidence. He talked about work but didn't look at me. I didn't accuse him. I didn't ask questions I already knew the answers to. I just listened. For the first time, I saw him clearly. Not as my husband, not as the man I once loved, but as someone who had chosen comfort over honesty and ego over loyalty. Then I understood something. If I yelled, he would deny it. If I cried, he would downplay it. If I begged, he would resent me for it. So I did none of those things. I made my decision in silence. The next morning, I contacted a family lawyer, gathered my documents, and separated what was mine. I stopped sharing my thoughts, my fears, my hopes. Barrett noticed the change but misunderstood it. He thought my silence meant surrender, that I would stay, adjust, and accept less, just as I had always done. He was wrong. I didn't leave because of Celine. I left because I recognized who I was becoming by staying, smaller, quieter, slowly disappearing. The day I packed my bags, Barrett asked me why I was so calm. I told him the truth. Because I'm already gone, and this time I'm not coming back. I didn't announce my departure to the world. I didn't post quotes about healing or being free. I just left. 2 weeks after that final dinner, I packed my clothes, my personal documents, and a few objects that still felt like mine. I left everything else behind, the apartment, the furniture, the life that no longer fit me. I moved to a small coastal town called Puerto Pino. It was the kind of place people pass through, not a place people escape to. It had quiet streets, old houses, and the sound of the sea carried on the wind. The house I moved into had been my grandmother's, a modest 2-story home with a small front garden and roses climbing a stone wall. She used to tell me that roots matter more than appearances. I finally understood what she meant. No one in Puerto Pino knew who I used to be. No one asked about my marriage. No one cared about my past. Here, I wasn't Barrett's wife. Here, I was just Veda. The first few weeks were strange. The silence felt loud at night. There were moments when I would reach for my phone out of habit, then remember there was no one I needed to update and no one whose message I was waiting for. I slept better, breathed deeper, and walked along the shore in the mornings, letting the cool air clear my head. For the first time in years, my mind wasn't racing to meet someone else's expectations. I didn't feel lonely. I felt space. Space to think. Space to remember who I was before I learned to make myself small. Space to imagine a future that didn't need permission. People assume that starting over is scary, a sign of failure. But standing there in that quiet house, with my suitcases still unpacked, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time: relief. Leaving wasn't running away, it was choosing myself. And though I didn't know it yet, that quiet town was where my real life was about to begin. Healing didn't happen all at once. It didn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic revelations. It came quietly, through routine, work, and small moments that slowly stitched me back together. After settling into the house, I started looking for a job. I had a master's degree in interior design and years of experience that I had never fully used. In my marriage, my career had always been secondary, convenient, and adjustable. Here, it finally mattered. I applied for a job at a small design studio in town run by a man named Grant. During the interview, he didn't ask about my marital status or why I had left the city. He asked about my ideas, my style, and my process. That alone felt revolutionary. I got the job in less than a week. Work became my anchor. I would get up early, walk to the studio, and lose myself in sketches, textures, and blueprints. No one interrupted me or dismissed my opinions. When I spoke, people listened. Grant trusted me. He gave me responsibility instead of supervision, feedback instead of control, and respect instead of demands. Outside of work, my life remained simple. I cooked for myself, worked in the garden, and read books I had bought years ago but never had time to open. My phone stayed silent, and for the first time, that silence felt peaceful, not empty. I didn't talk about Barrett or replay old arguments in my head. I stopped asking myself what I could have done differently. Healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about no longer living in it. Little by little, I felt stronger, more present, more real. The woman who had spent years minimizing herself was gone. In her place was someone quieter, firmer, and much more certain of her own worth. I wasn't rebuilding myself to prove anything to anyone. I was rebuilding because my life finally belonged to me. The news of Barrett's wedding reached me like most things from my old life, distant, muted, and unimportant. It was my friend Eden who told me. She called one evening while I was cooking dinner, her voice careful as if she were carrying something fragile. "His wedding is next Saturday," she said. "The big one. Celine is getting everything she ever wanted." I waited for a reaction that never came. There was no tightness in my chest, no anger, no sadness. Just a brief pause. I thanked her for letting me know and went back to stirring my soup. In the city, the event was being advertised as a spectacle, a luxury venue, imported flowers, and a guest list full of people Barrett wanted to impress. It was the kind of wedding designed to showcase success rather than celebrate love. Eden kept talking, filling the silence with details she thought might matter to me. How expensive the dress was, how Celine was showing off, how proud and triumphant Barrett looked, as if he had won something. I listened politely and then stopped her. "Eden," I said, "I'm really okay." And I was. That same day, I spent the morning walking along the coast. The wind was cool and the sky was clear. I stopped for coffee at a small cafe where the server already knew my name. In the afternoon, I worked in my garden, with soil under my nails and sun on my face. While they were rehearsing their entrances and speeches, I was choosing herbs for dinner. That's when it truly hit me. Indifference isn't insensitivity, it's freedom. I didn't need to see photos or get updates. Their celebration was theirs, and my life was mine. That evening, I invited a few coworkers over for a simple dinner. We talked about work, travel, and nothing important at all. Laughter filled the house my grandmother had left me. Somewhere across the country, Barrett was preparing for the biggest day of his new life, and I was already living mine. For the first time, I understood with absolute clarity. When you stop caring, you stop being controlled. And that was a victory no wedding could ever match. I thought the story would end there. A wedding I didn't attend, a life I had already moved on from. But sometimes the past makes one last appearance, not to pull you back, but to show you what was always hidden. The morning after the wedding, Eden called again. This time, she didn't even try to soften her voice. "Veda, are you sitting down?" I smiled to myself and took a sip of coffee. I was standing in my kitchen with the sun pouring over the counter. "I'm standing," I said calmly. "What happened now?" "There was an unexpected guest at the wedding," she said. "Someone who knows you." That got my attention. It turned out that Barrett's father had invited an old business acquaintance, a man named Quentin. He had known my grandmother years ago. He was a loud, friendly type who talked even more when he drank. Eden said that near the end of the reception, Quentin was at a table with some guests, a glass of wine in his hand, telling stories loud enough for half the room to hear. He started talking about a trip to the coast, about a small town, and about running into his old friend's granddaughter. My chest tightened just a little. "He talked about you, Veda," Eden continued, "about how well you were doing, your house, your garden, your job." Apparently, someone at the table asked if I was just visiting. Quentin laughed and said, "No, she lives there now. Her grandmother left her the house. She's doing wonderfully." The guests leaned in to listen. Then someone else asked if I was working. Quentin waved his hand and said, "Of course she's working. She's at a design studio. Her boss loves her, says she just landed them a huge hotel project." Eden paused, letting the silence build, and then said, "Someone joked that you must be earning good money." Quentin laughed again. "The salary is the least of it. That girl is already set. Her grandmother left her a fortune, millions. I closed my eyes. Eden told me that at that very moment, Barrett and Celine were nearby, greeting guests. They heard everything. Word for word, table by table, the murmur spread. The ex-wife he had cast aside wasn't struggling. She wasn't broken. She was rich, independent, and free. And the groom? The groom was in debt. One casual comment, one unfiltered truth, and the illusion Barrett had spent years building began to crack in front of everyone he wanted to impress. I didn't need to be there. The truth had arrived on its own. According to Eden, the mood in the room changed the instant those words landed. At first, Barrett didn't react. He stood frozen with a stiff smile, as if his mind was trying to catch up to reality. Celine's hand tightened on his arm, her expression caught between shock and calculation. People nearby started to whisper, first quietly, then louder. Heads turned, gazes lingered, and phones were lowered, forgotten in hands that suddenly wanted to know more. Barrett had built his identity on perception, success, control, and superiority. Now, in a matter of seconds, that carefully polished image was shattering. Someone laughed awkwardly. Another guest asked a question that should never be asked at a wedding. Is it true? Barrett turned to Celine, not gently, not lovingly. He looked at her like a man who has just realized the ground no longer exists beneath his feet. What was he talking about? Barrett asked, his voice sharp. About millions. Celine tried to smile, tried to brush it off. You know how people exaggerate when they've been drinking, she said. But the seed of doubt had already been planted. Then someone else spoke up, a man from the financial sector. He mentioned a rumor that Barrett had been borrowing money, a small amount just to cover some expenses. That's when Barrett lost control. His voice rose and glasses vibrated on the tables as he demanded answers. Celine tried to pull him away, whispering that people were watching, but it was too late. Barrett grabbed a champagne flute and shattered it in his hand. Blood stained the white tablecloth. Someone screamed. The music stopped, and he shouted. Accusations, regret, and fury all exploded at once. You lied to me, he bellowed. You made me look like an idiot. Guests backed away. Parents rushed forward. The staff stood frozen. The wedding became a spectacle no one could ignore. Barrett flipped a table. Food crashed to the floor. The cake stood intact for a moment before it, too, went down in the chaos. Celine was crying, her perfect dress stained, her tiara slipping from her hair. This is the cost of living for appearances. When the image breaks, there's nothing left to hold you up. The man who once believed he had won it all was left in the middle of the room, exposed, humiliated, and completely alone. I was miles away, watering plants in my garden, and yet the truth had finally reached him. Not through revenge, but through reality. What happened at the wedding didn't stay in that ballroom. According to Eden, videos started circulating before the guests had even reached their cars. A groom screaming, tables overturned, blood on a white tablecloth, a bride crying while people recorded instead of helping. By morning, the footage was everywhere. His partners saw it, his clients saw it. Investors who once praised his discipline and leadership saw a man who couldn't control his emotions in public, let alone in a boardroom. Meetings were canceled, calls went unanswered, and contracts were quietly withdrawn. No one needed an explanation. A reputation speaks for itself. In a matter of weeks, the company Barrett had built began to fall apart. Key employees resigned, taking clients with them. No one wanted to remain loyal to a leader who had become a liability overnight. Celine disappeared from public life just as quickly. The pregnancy she had spoken of with such pride was suddenly no longer mentioned. Instead of admiration, she was followed by whispers. Doors that once opened for her were now closed. Barrett tried to salvage what he could with dinner meetings, promises he couldn't keep, and apologies that came too late. But trust, once broken, doesn't return just because you demand it. Eden told me he started drinking heavily and looked older, thinner, like someone living in constant expectation of bad news. I listened without satisfaction. I didn't feel victorious or happy. I just felt distant. This wasn't a punishment delivered by my hand. It was the natural outcome of decisions made with arrogance and secrets. A life built on illusion will eventually collapse under its own weight. People like to call this karma, as if it's something mystical or cruel, but it's not. It's simply cause and effect. And while Barrett was busy losing everything he thought defined him, I was gaining something far more valuable: peace. While Barrett's world was shrinking, mine was quietly expanding. I stopped getting news about him, not because people stopped talking, but because I stopped asking. His story no longer had a place in my days. I had work to do, a life to build, and a version of myself to honor. At the studio, I was trusted with bigger projects. My ideas weren't questioned, only refined. When I presented designs, people leaned in to see instead of looking over me. For the first time in my adult life, my value was measured by my ability, not my availability. One afternoon, Grant called me into his office. He thanked me for my work and then offered me a raise and more responsibility on an upcoming project. I remember walking home with a strange feeling in my chest. It was pride, not the loud kind, but the quiet pride that settles deep inside and stays. At home, the garden was in full bloom. The roses climbed higher, the herbs grew strong, and every plant felt like proof that consistent care creates growth. I spent my nights reading, cooking, and learning new things. I signed up for courses I had put off for years. I traveled alone without explaining myself to anyone. I didn't need validation or witnesses. During those months, I understood something important. I hadn't escaped a bad marriage. I had escaped a version of myself that believed love required limitless sacrifice. Freedom didn't come as revenge. It came as ownership. Ownership of my time, my energy, my future. Barrett once told me I would struggle without him. Standing there in my kitchen, surrounded by a life I built with my own hands, I finally understood how wrong he was. I didn't win. I was set free. And that freedom was worth everything I left behind. For a long time, I thought strength meant holding on, staying, proving my loyalty by surviving discomfort and silence. I was wrong. True strength was knowing when to leave without destroying yourself in the process. I didn't expose Barrett. I didn't confront Celine. I didn't plan revenge, and I didn't wait around for karma to arrive. I simply chose a different life. And in doing so, I removed myself from the harm they were creating. What happened to them wasn't my victory. It was their consequence. My victory was waking up without anxiety, working without being diminished, and loving myself without needing permission. I learned that walking away doesn't mean you lost. Sometimes it means you finally chose yourself. If you are listening to this and you feel invisible in your own life, hear this clearly. You are not weak for being tired. You are not broken for wanting peace. And you do not have to stay where you are no longer valued. Sometimes the most powerful answer is silence. Sometimes the greatest revenge is a life well lived. Your story matters too.